The iconic Imperial Roman Legionary was an elite professional soldier that developed from the landowning citizen soldiers of the Roman Republic. From the reforms of Gaius Marius in 107 BC that laid the basis for the Roman legion, to Sulla, Pompey Magnus, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius, in structure and organization, the elite heavy infantry of the legion remained the core of the Roman army. These legions were primarily comprised of Latin-speaking Roman citizens from the Italian peninsula and Rome's colonies throughout the Mediterranean, who were supported by a wide variety of auxiliary troops, notably cavalry, archers, and slinger units, who were typically not of Italian stock. Following the height of Rome's power and glory in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the 3rd century gave way to chaos and near constant civil war. Plague swept through the empire, and a new formidable enemy rose in the east, the Sasanian Persians. Germanic tribes also took advantage of the chaos, raiding and/or attempting to settle across the Roman borders. With the empire seemingly on the verge of imminent collapse, competent soldier emperors from Illyria, roughly corresponding to the former Yugoslavia, stabilized the empire. Diocletian was one of them, who instituted wide-ranging reforms throughout his reign, including a complete reorganization of the military to take into account those times. The new army that emerged from this reorganization bore little resemblance to the Roman legions that had preceded it. Cavalry and missile troops took on an increasingly important role, as responding to border incursions rapidly and effectively became the army's primary directive, in contrast to earlier legions' campaigns of conquest. Despite this, the late Roman infantrymen would remain the army's most important component well into the 5th century, and arguably later. Late Roman infantrymen, or pedes, were divided into two broad categories: the border garrisons and the larger mobile field armies. A great deal of time and resources were spent on maintaining, building, and improving a vast network of fortifications along the northern and eastern borders. The limitanei and repenses that manned these fortifications received decreased pay and were generally lighter armed and less trained than their colleagues in the mobile field armies. Although this was not always the case, as many quality career soldiers from low to high rank preferred to be permanently stationed near their families, especially in the fortifications guarding Rome's large eastern cities, such as Antioch and Damascus. These garrisons, roughly consisting of about 3,000 men, were tasked with crushing minor enemy incursions across the border, or in the case of a larger invasion, with harassing and slowing down the enemy army, attacking foragers and the supply train whenever possible, ideally slowing them down to the point where a larger field army could intercept them on favorable ground within Roman territory. Some historians have described this as in-depth defense. Over time, two categories of mobile field armies developed. Units of paltini were originally organized from members of the Praetorian Guard. After the Emperor Constantine disbanded them in 312 AD, these units eventually formed the bulk of the army the Emperor personally commanded, and continued to increase in number over time, and were included in the ranks of the armies commanded by the Magister Militum and even lesser generals. These elite units were the highest paid and trained regular infantry in the empire. The main component of the mobile field army was a comitatenses, coming from the word comitatus, meaning company or companion. These troops may not have been as disciplined and drilled as the earlier imperial legionaries, but made up for that in flexibility. These later Roman infantry were not only trained to fight in close order in a similar fashion to the earlier Greek phalanx, particularly when facing cavalry. The late Roman phalanx was typically deployed in 4, 8, or 16 ranks deep, as anything below 4 had no staying power, and anything over 16 added nothing to the formation strength, with 8 ranks of depth being the most commonly utilized, as it efficiently balanced both the amount of men that could participate in the fight as well as the staying power of the unit, but was also trained to fight in loose order as a skirmisher, wielding javelins while being paired up with an archer, with a large portion of the infantry being trained in the bow, so they could be used as archers if the battlefield situation called for it. The comitatenses was trained also as a shock troop to fight in a similar fashion as a Germanic warrior, which many of them wear, especially in the west. After hurling a flurry of javelins and or darts, called plumbata, that the soldier would carry on the inside of their shield, a long slashing sword was used, the spatha becoming particularly popular, which was previously a cavalry sword. Limitanei and paltini were also trained in these variety of roles, but were likely less often required to switch roles in comparison to the comitatenses. In stark contrast to earlier times, these troops were recruited and conscripted from all classes and people groups within the empire, and even from beyond its borders. Every year, 15,000 to 30,000 recruits were needed to replenish the ranks of the Roman army, which on paper was 500,000 strong, to replace those that had retired after 2 decades of service, and those that had succumbed to disease and death on the battlefield. Germans, Illyrians, Thracians, Central Anatolians, and Syrians became the most common recruits over time, many of them speaking little to no Latin. Recruits were 19 to 25 years old, and although the prestige and pay had diminished from earlier times, the Roman infantryman could still expect a land grant after 20 years of service, and still provided opportunities for social mobility for the adventurous, ambitious, and the desperate, such as the Emperor Justin I and father of Justinian, who was born a peasant herdsman in a small village in Illyria, and died a Roman emperor in Constantinople. A substantial number of individuals, the Romans considered barbarians, crossed the border to join the army. By using the bribe money from a reluctant draftee, the army could hire a willing German instead, who were known for their loyal service before the practice of hiring in mass began, and sometimes entire tribes negotiated to fight for Rome. These tribes, called the Foederati, were sometimes incorporated into the Roman army to varying degrees, sometimes retaining their native style of fighting. In the late Empire, the obligation to serve in the army passed from father to son, unless he was deemed unfit for service. With the dwindling population, hereditary and volunteer enlistment was not enough to fill the ranks of the Roman war machine, so the practice began of levying conscripts from every village, town, and estate in the empire. A required number of fit young men were to be provided, in a similar way as gathering taxes. This proved so unpopular that self-mutilation and the payment of bribes to avoid this sort of draft was not uncommon. In desperate times, prisoners of war, slaves, and conscripts were pressed into the ranks, and the earlier requirement that a recruit be 5 foot 10 inches tall seems to have been largely ignored. Rome's strategy in the West relied off of playing northern Germanic tribes against each other. Although effective for a time, eventually Romanized Franks, Saxons, Visigoths, and Lombards, among others, came to dominate the West. The Western Roman Empire faded out of existence, rather than abruptly falling, although its official end could be said to be 476, when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, abdicated, and his position abolished. Little changed in regular people's lives, however, such as in Visigothic Spain, where Eastern Roman authority was recognized, largely in name only. This was a win-win for everybody, as it gave the Visigoths legitimacy in the eyes of the largely Roman population which they ruled. It also gave the Eastern Roman emperor more prestige. This arrangement was put to an end a generation later, when Justinian asked the Visigoths for a tax. The Visigoths refused to pay, and Justinian used this as one of his many pretexts to invade the West. Flavius Belisarius, one of the greatest generals ever to have lived, demonstrated what the late Roman army was capable of. After defeating the Persians in the east, he conquered their formidable Vandal kingdom, and then reconquered Italy from the Ostrogoths. By the end of Justinian's reign, the Eastern Roman Empire was at its height, and for a brief moment, the power and glory of Rome's ancient past had been restored. The Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire as it is commonly called, replaced this system with the theme system in the mid-7th century. The Byzantine Empire continued to exist up until 1453, when they were conquered by the Ottoman Turks. The late Roman army, in particular the infantryman, has received many not-so-glamorous assessments in the past, largely due to the fact that his direct predecessor is perhaps the most renowned and successful infantryman in all of history, the Imperial Roman Legionary. The view of the late Roman infantryman being a cheap knockoff of a classic has slowly but surely changed over time. The robust nature of Rome's army is nothing short of remarkable, and a testament to the adaptability of Rome's military doctrine, effectively changing to the times and available resources. Rather than ask, why did Rome fall? It is perhaps a more interesting question to ask, why did it last so long? In my opinion, it is in significant part to the courage, skill, and adaptability of the late Roman infantrymen that prolonged the empire's life. They frequently outperformed cavalry in battle, which received higher pay and more prestige. This has been Epimetheus. Let me know what you think of this style of video, and be sure to subscribe if this is your first time watching and would like to see more content like this. Hit the bell icon and a like. Huge thanks to my awesome patrons over on Patreon, and don't forget to comment, as that really helps me out.